You'll have to excuse me, I'm short. So, okay. All right. Can everyone hear me okay? All right. Good morning and welcome. Thank you guys so much for coming out, or those of you that are watching online as well. Today I'm going to talk about the cost of living report for 2024. Let's go ahead and get to the next slide. Just want to hit on the agenda here first really quick. We're going to discuss the Massachusetts cost of living for 2024. So we're going to start with our state first. Then we're going to dive into the out of reach report for 2024, a living wage, private equity, solutions, and then Q&A. So first and foremost, how many of you remember the '08 housing crisis? Raise your hand. Right? Yeah. Did you know that today we not only have a housing crisis, but we have a cost of living crisis? And that's what I want to dive into a little bit here today with a little bit of audience participation. Raise your hand if you grew up in Massachusetts. Oh, not everyone. Okay. Raise your hand if you moved to Massachusetts, if you were a transplant. Yeah, me too. Okay. So for those of you that grew up in Massachusetts, you can probably tell that the cost of living in Massachusetts has greatly increased, right? This is an expensive state to live in, but it's not the only one. And for those of you, if you're like me and you moved to Massachusetts, most likely you probably came from a state that was less expensive than Massachusetts. Am I correct? Where did you come from?
Kansas.
Okay, there you go. That's a big difference, big difference. So why is this important? Did you know that the recent cost of living report shows that Massachusetts has the second highest housing wage in the United States? Now, this was not the case last year. We have now bumped up ahead of the state of New York. But it's not just about Massachusetts, and we're going to dive into why there are certain reasons why this is happening across the country. But if you live in the Boston area, or if you've lived in the Boston area, I'm pretty sure you know that rent is very expensive. It's just a reality. But if we look a little bit deeper, you'll notice something else. Massachusetts, according to the Out of Reach report for 2024, the minimum wage in this state is $15 an hour. And I point that out because there is a big push for a fight for 15. We already have that here, and it's still expensive to live here. Right now, if you make $15 an hour, you would have to work 98 hours a week to afford a modest one-bedroom rental in Massachusetts. Now, for those of you that live here, that probably does not sound unusual, right? This is why a lot of people have roommates. But there's something else I want to show you. In order to afford a two-bedroom rental in Massachusetts, you would need to make $44.84 an hour. Now, I don't know about you, but there's a lot of people that live in Massachusetts, particularly in the Boston area, that are not making over $44 an hour. And if we dive just a little bit deeper, you'll see something else. Facts about Massachusetts. Minimum wage, $15 an hour. The average renter wage is $28.70 an hour. Again, you would need to make $44.84 an hour to afford a two-bedroom rental in Massachusetts. But if you look at the most expensive areas, I think this is a very telling piece. Boston, Cambridge, and Quincy area. This is where the price will start to change. If you live in that area, you actually need to earn $54.37 an hour to afford a two-bedroom rental. Notice it increases as you go to certain areas. Nantucket County, $48.58 an hour. Easton, Renham, I have no idea where that is, by the way, $48.08. Dukes County, $41.46. And Barnstable, which I think you can't see, it's this little thing here. Let me move this up out of the way. Barnstable-town, $40.04 an hour. The problem is, it's not just Massachusetts. It's easy to start with this state, but as we dive into the report, you're going to see that this is a trend that is happening all across the country. The National Low Income Housing Coalition releases a report every July. It is called the Out of Reach Report. They have been sounding the alarm about the cost of living crisis for years. This is not something that started with 2024. The reality is that Americans have been playing catch up. A $15 minimum wage is not going to fix this. And this is why I really wanted to have this discussion, because there's been a lot of talk about a $15 minimum wage, which I think we do need to increase the minimum wage. But that in itself is not going to fix the cost of living crisis that we have in this country. First, I want to dive into what caused this and how do we resolve it. It's really important that we get into solutions as well. So as we go into this report, I'm just going to share my screen here. If you see me play with this on my channel before, this is not unusual to you. You've seen this before probably, but a lot of people have not. A lot of people don't know about this report. We're going to start with the state of California. There are a couple of states here that I do want to highlight, and there's a reason for that. California has the highest housing wage in the country. In California, you would need to make $47.38 an hour to afford a 2-bedroom rental. We'll go into a little bit more details here. As you can also see, that the current minimum wage in California is $16 an hour. So they're above the 15 minimum threshold. You would need to make, if you make $16 an hour, you would need to work 96 hours a week to afford a 1-bedroom rental. That's California. So what we are seeing across the board, most expensive state, highest cost of housing, already over the $15 minimum wage. But you would still need to earn $47.38 an hour to afford a 2-bedroom rental in California. And then we'll go a little bit deeper here when we get into the details. Because California, like Massachusetts, also has higher areas that are more expensive. And what is interesting about California in particular is that, notice that Los Angeles is not listed as one of the most expensive areas. Instead, what you have is Santa Cruz, Watsonville, $77.96 an hour. That's what you need to make in that area to afford housing. This is insane. San Francisco, $64.60 an hour. This is going into the tech bubble. San Jose and Sunnyvale and Santa Clara, $60 an hour. Santa Maria, Santa Barbara, 57, and 58 cents an hour. Salinas, $55, little over $55 an hour. That's California. And I point out California because the danger that I notice now that Massachusetts is now number 2, California is showing you what not to do. And we are headed in that direction. But it's not just California. The next state that I want to look at is Florida because I want to prove a point. A lot of times people will see this and they'll point out the fact that it's just the blue states, it's the Democrat states that are expensive. That is actually not the case. When we go to Florida, we are seeing that Florida has the 10th highest housing wage. In Florida, you need to make $35.24 an hour to afford a 2-bedroom rental. We'll get into a little bit more details here with Florida. Right now, the current minimum wage in Florida is $12 an hour. So they haven't reached the $15 threshold, but they're getting close to there. You would need to work 98 hours a week in Florida to afford a 1-bedroom rental. Now, this is Ron DeSantis' state, correct? This is Ron DeSantis' state, the same governor who told you that California is a problem, it's too expensive. But Ron DeSantis doesn't want to mention to you that his own state is becoming unaffordable. Ron DeSantis told police officers to move to Florida. We will pay you more money. If you live in these blue states, come to our state and we will pay you more. Ron DeSantis is adding to the problem. If we look a little bit deeper with Florida in particular, the most expensive areas, Miami Beach, Kendall, you would need to make $44.69 an hour. West Palm Beach, Boca, $42.81 an hour. Monroe County, $41.13 an hour. Fort Lauderdale, $40 an hour. Orlando, Kissimmee, this is the Walt Disney area. You need to make over $35 an hour. And the reason I point out Ron DeSantis is to prove a point. A lot of people are going to tell you that the solution is to move. That if you live in an expensive state, you need to move to a more affordable state. But Florida is the perfect example that you should not do that. Florida has become more expensive over the years because there has been an influx of people moving to Florida from states like Massachusetts, New York, Washington State, California. That is why Florida has increased. And we can also get into another discussion another day about Walt Disney as well. So that does not solve the problem. Florida used to be a swing state. I think we can all say Florida's a red state. Next, we're going to go to Colorado, and I point to Colorado for a reason as well. Colorado is not on the coast. The most expensive states tend to be on the West Coast or the East Coast, but Colorado, for whatever reason, is ranked 8th highest housing wage. So what happened to Colorado? This isn't a state that has like a huge tech bubble, which we see on the West Coast and the East Coast. We have it here in Massachusetts. We see it in California, Washington State, etc. But something happened here. In Colorado, you would need to earn $37.47 an hour to afford a 2-bedroom rental. If we go into a little bit more details, you'll see here as well. Colorado, the current minimum wage is $14.42 an hour. They're almost at $15 minimum wage. You would need to work 85 hours to afford a 1-bedroom rental. And by the way, this is a modest rental. This is not like a luxury 1-bedroom apartment. This is Colorado. Now, if we look at the most expensive areas in Colorado, we're seeing similar patterns here. Eagle County, $44.60 an hour. This is what you would need to make. Summit County, $42.69 an hour. Boulder, $42.63. Denver, Aurora, Lakewood, $42.33. Pitkin County, $39.62. The trend that we are seeing in all of these states is that the areas that seem to have the most jobs are the areas that are the most expensive. Right? This is where people are more likely to move to. If I were to make a guess with Colorado, I would assume that part of the influx into the Denver area a couple years ago, this was a trendy place to move to, could have something to do with that. But Colorado is one that really needs to be studied in particular. Now we're going to go further south. We're going to go to the state of Georgia. Georgia is also, I guess, a swing state now, but typically it was a red state for the most part. Even in Georgia, down south, 20th highest housing wage. In Georgia, you need to earn $28.98 an hour to afford a 2-bedroom rental. If we go into the details here with Georgia, and I can explain what I think happened with this particular state. The current minimum wage in Georgia is $7.25 an hour. It is the federal minimum wage. You need to work 140 hours a week to afford a one-bedroom rental in Georgia. If we look at the most expensive areas, same pattern. Atlanta, Sandy Springs, Roswell, $35.46 an hour. Savannah, $27. Gainesville, $26. Morgan County, $25. Butts County, $24. There have been an influx of people moving to the Atlanta area. There's entertainment businesses there. There's a lot of jobs in the Atlanta metro. But the fact that the minimum wage in Georgia is still listed as $7.25 an hour, that is not okay. Georgia's one of them. Then we have two more we want to look at. And I'm going to point to Texas, the red state of Texas, because Texas is 23rd highest housing wage. You would need to make $27.88 an hour to afford a two-bedroom rental in Texas. If we can go into the details here, make sure I'm hovering over this correctly. So we can look at the most expensive areas here in Texas. And what's interesting about this particular state, there's two things that are going on in Texas. Number one, there are certain cities in Texas. I believe that state has the most cities that are the most, have the highest employment rate. So in Texas, you have Austin, Dallas, Houston is a big one. If you look up the top 10 cities where people are moving to for employment, Texas has, I think, 4 of them in the top 10. But Texas also has the same problem that Georgia has. The current minimum wage in Texas is $7.25 an hour. You would need to work 129 hours in Texas to afford a one-bedroom rental apartment. If we look at a little bit more detail here, the most expensive areas, we are seeing the same trend. Austin, Round Rock, $37 an hour. Dallas, $33. Kendall County, $32. Fort Worth, Arlington, $31. Midland, $31. The other problem with Texas in particular has been a huge influx of California residents moving to Texas. This is causing the cost in Texas to increase. It's part of it, but it's not all of it. And last but least, we're going to look at one that people may not think to look at, and that's Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is the lowest cost of all. They are ranked 52nd highest housing wage. You need to make $11.58 an hour to afford a two-bedroom rental in Puerto Rico. Now, I know people are going to hear that and say, let's all move to Puerto Rico. Like, what are we waiting for? But I will explain to you why, again, that is a temporary solution, not a permanent solution. In Puerto Rico right now, the current minimum wage is $10.50 an hour. The minimum wage in Puerto Rico is higher than the minimum wage in Georgia and in Texas. Let that sink in for a second. In Puerto Rico, you need to work 39 hours a week to afford a one-bedroom rental. And if we look a little bit closer at the details here, again, just like the other, you will see the most expensive areas: San Juan, Farado, Mayagüez, Barranquitas, and Ponce. Again, these are the most expensive areas, but look at it. $12.85 an hour, $11.85, or just over $10, $9.40 an hour. So Puerto Rico, very affordable. But the reality is, Puerto Rico, or everyone moving to Puerto Rico, is not the answer. It's not the long-term answer. You will start to see the same problem happen in Puerto Rico that you're seeing happen in Florida, Georgia, Texas, etc. So we go back here. So getting back to this point here, what caused this and how do we solve it? We need to start with the minimum wage. The federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. Remember, this is the least amount that you can pay someone by law. Minimum wage increases have been made through the states. We've had them here in Massachusetts. But according to the Out of Reach report that I just showed you for 2024, a $15 minimum wage at this point is not enough. When was the last time that the minimum wage was increased? Let's take a look at the history of increases of the minimum wage. This is from the U.S. Department of Labor. In 1996, there were amendments that increased the minimum wage to $4.75 an hour on October 1st, 1996 to $5.15 an hour, September 1st of 1997. Then we want to fast forward here to 2007, second paragraph. The 2007 amendments increased the minimum wage from $5.85 an hour, effective July 24th, 2007, and then $6.55 an hour, which was effective July 24th in 2008. And then $7.25 an hour, which was effective July 24th, 2009. Ladies and gentlemen, the minimum wage has not increased since 2009. It is 2024. So let's pretend it did. If the minimum wage increased every year since then, that would roughly put us at about $15 an hour. That's where the $15 comes from. But according to that Out of Reach report, a $15 minimum wage at this point is not enough. There's a picture there of Professor Richard Wolff, because even Professor Richard Wolff would tell you this is not enough. The problem with the minimum wage is that it does not adjust for inflation. So what should we be discussing? A living wage. A minimum wage versus a living wage. The minimum wage is the least amount a worker can earn by law. Right now, that's $7.25 an hour. But a living wage is based on the cost of living and would prevent families from entering poverty. We have to change our focus. I noticed throughout the years, and I'm guilty of this as well, we continue to discuss the fight for 15. We need a $15 minimum wage. But what we're doing is we're fighting for the least amount a worker can be paid. We should be fighting for more. We should be fighting for a living wage. So we have to change our focus. We have to stop focusing on a $15 minimum wage and start focusing on a living wage. And you can see in the picture here with the living wage, notice the scale is balanced. As long as we are focusing simply on the minimum wage, we're going to continue, to have a problem with poverty in this country, because again, the minimum wage does not adjust for inflation. So that's one of the reasons how we got here as a society. This country is not paying workers a living wage. And then there's another reason. There's something called private equity firms. Raise your hand if you're familiar with private equity firms. A couple people. Okay. This one kind of just snuck under the radar, because now, according to ProPublica, private equity is now the dominant form of financial backing among 35 largest owners of multifamily buildings. You could live in a building that is owned by a private equity firm and you may not even know it. Private equity firms increase rent, and oftentimes they'll decrease services and amenities, by the way. You'll see that in a second. There's a video that I want to play. If you can cue that up, Amar, to show you a little bit more about private equity and what has been happening in this country. This video, this news segment here was 2 years ago, so it has increased since then.
Rent is on the rise in cities across the country. Tonight, skyrocketing rents forcing a growing number of Americans to think twice about where home is.
It's been making news for months. Rent is up. Rental prices increasing more than 30% in major cities across the U.S. There's a handful of reasons for the surge, but experts say one in particular is key: private equity firms. Private equity firms raise money from institutional and accredited investors, so not just from any ordinary person. Those funds are then invested in different types of assets with the aim of getting a return on investment.
A lot of these private equity-backed firms really moved into the apartment market, the multifamily market, in a big way after the last housing crisis. They also moved into the single-family market. What they do is they go out and they find these buildings. They typically make some changes quickly to try to increase the profit.
Vogel, a housing reporter with ProPublica, says private equity firms increase profit by raising rent and cutting other building expenses.
You know, maintenance, security, all those sorts of important things that people really rely on to live in these buildings comfortably.
Tenant advocates like Sophia Lopez say those money-saving measures for equity firms cost tenants.
The tenants have told me stories about having to live without working heat in the dead of winter in some pretty cold places like Minneapolis. In one case, a tenant told me a story about water that was over an electrical outlet and needing the power to be turned off, and the company telling her that she'd have to turn it off herself, which would have required her to wade through standing electrified water.
Beyond safety concerns, there's the issue of affordability for renters and home buyers. The median home price in the U.S. hitting a high of $416,000 in June. With rising mortgage rates and expensive house costs slowing home sales and pushing many to rent. Nationwide, the average rent for a one-bedroom, $1,701, while a two-bedroom is $2,048. That's a more than 25% increase since last year. As rents drastically increase, experts like Vogel say private equity firms are a main reason why. In February 2022, Vogel found that private equity firms play a major role in the rental market. Vogel reporting how mortgage finance companies like Freddie Mac are fueling the rise in housing costs. Since 2015, Freddie Mac gave billions to these firms, including real estate company Greystar.
Most of us in the industry are getting very aggressive in driving expenses down.
Here's Greystar CEO discussing his firm's ability to cut costs back in 2010.
We can drive dramatic savings out of the expense side of the equation.
But residents worry private equity firms' savings will come at a cost, pricing them out of previously affordable homes.
A lot of the tenant advocates that we've talked to also.
So you guys get the picture there. The private equity firms, they kind of flew under the radar. A lot of people don't know about it. And if you can talk to other tenants, they probably tell you they had no idea that their apartment building was owned by a private equity firm. I'm going to bring up the slideshow here. So private equity is a big problem. And you'll see that some of the ones that were mentioned there, I want to show it here as well. Again, ProPublica was warning people about this. Greystar, private equity, yes. Lone Star, Starwood Capital, and then I think the other one at the bottom is KKG. All private equity. These borrowers that are highlighted white, Southern Management, and Irvine Company are not private equity. But the reality is a lot of people just don't know. It kind of reminds me of BlackRock, right? A lot of people just don't know what BlackRock is or what they do. But once you start researching, you find this out. This is why the quality of housing has decreased in a lot of these apartment buildings. This is why the rent continues to increase even during the pandemic, when there were some mayors, particularly in Massachusetts, that said we were not going to do that. We have lost control on the housing issue in this country because private equity firms have found a way to buy in. Now, this is important because when we get to solutions, I broke this up into two different sections: temporary solutions and long-term solutions. So the two problems I brought to you is we don't have a living wage. We need a living wage in this country, and the private equity firms that are pricing everybody out. And one thing I want to mention about private equity as well, again, they're not just buying apartment buildings, they're buying single family homes as well. This is why a lot of college graduates can't afford to buy a single family home. They are buying those homes, they are renovating them, they jack up the price, and they sell them to other investors. That's why it's hard for you to buy a home. So we have to change the talking point of there's not enough housing. Even if you look at a city like San Francisco, that is not the case. There is vacant housing that is available, but the city is not choosing to house people in the vacant housing. So this idea of we just need to build more homes, that does not solve the problem. There is plenty of housing, there's plenty of vacant housing that is not being used. So these temporary solutions, the first one, move to a cheaper state. That can help you in the short term. One of the pros of that is, again, you'll have a lower cost of living in the short term. But one of the cons is that an influx of transplants will increase the demand. The demand will increase the cost of living. You can look at Florida, you can look at North Carolina, and I myself have lived in those southern states that were more affordable, South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, and I can tell you that over time you saw the change, because as more people move in, the demand is going to increase. When the demand increase, the cost of living is going to increase. So that's a short-term solution. There was an article written by the Boston Globe recently where they were advising college graduates to leave Massachusetts and move to Michigan. And I'm sorry, that is not a long-term solution. What again is going to happen to Michigan is that Michigan again will start to become unaffordable. So we have to look bigger. Another temporary solution, earn an advanced degree. Go back to school. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard that one before. Just go back to school and get another degree, right? So the pros about that is you can get a possible salary increase. And I say possible because it depends on which profession you're in. I was in education, our increases weren't that much. So just being honest. But the con about this is that this can cause an increase in student loan debt. And the cost of living may be worse while you're in school. For a lot of us that went to grad school, you're not going to be able to work as many hours when you're not in school. So you'll have to struggle there for those couple of years while you do go back to school. And the last one, job hop. This is another one that a lot of Gen Z kids have been doing, no fault of their own, staying at a company for a year or a couple of months and then going to another company so you can get that pay increase, right? Now, a lot of times this can be a generational thing. I think sometimes like those from an older generation, they look at that and they're saying, why are these kids not staying here for longer than 1 year? A lot of that has to do with cost of living. They know that they can get a higher increase in their pay if they leave that job after a year and they're hired by another company. That's how you get the biggest increase, by the way. It's leaving the company you're at and going to another one. So the pro with that is a salary increase. The con about that, though, is, as I mentioned, some employers are going to frown upon job hopping. When they look at your resume, someone will say, why were you only there for a year? And then there's the issue of retirement funds. So if you are investing in 401k, every time you choose to go to a different company, that is also going to be an issue. In some cases, you can just transfer it over. That can be complicated depending on which company you worked at. And in other cases, you may not be able to, and they'll tell you you have to cash out. We can have another discussion one day about 401k because there's studies that are showing that a lot of younger adults are choosing not to opt into a 401k because they can't afford it. But in the end, we need to look at long-term solutions. The first one is we need to demand a living wage. So as I said before, we have to change our focus. We cannot continue to just say, fight for 15 minimum wage. Again, we're asking politicians, we're begging them to give people the least amount you can pay a worker by law, right? So we need to ask for more. We need to demand a living wage. What is the method of doing this? We can do this on the state level or on the federal level. My advice, it might be easier to try to start at the states. I think we've seen here in Massachusetts, we're a ballot initiative state. We've passed a number of progressive measures here in Massachusetts because we're a ballot initiative state. So those are two different ways to do that, the method. And what are the pros? A living wage adjusts to the cost of living. That's the big one. One of the cons, corporations could increase prices. And I have to be honest with you about that. The moment they see that we are making more money, corporations could decide, let's increase the price of gas. Let's increase the price of milk. You see it right now at the grocery stores, right? So that's just an honest reality. The second long-term solution, and this is a big one, we need to outlaw private equity firms from owning housing. That is probably one of the best methods that we can use. And how can we do this? It may be easier by the state level, and you can do it via ballot initiative, meaning you can run a ballot measure in any of your states, run a ballot measure that is going to outlaw private equity from owning housing, period. Because they're not going to stop. And there's no limit to that, apparently. So that's a big one. To add to that ballot measure, in a state like Massachusetts, which is an indirect ballot initiative state, which means that these measures have to be approved by the legislature and then it can go to the ballot, we would probably need to change something within our amendment here in Massachusetts where we can overturn this idea that the legislator has to approve these ballot measures before they're put on the ballot. Because there are states like California that's a direct initiative state. They don't have to go through the legislature. They meet the petition requirements and it goes directly on the ballot. So we could do that as a combination. What are the pros? It prevents overpriced apartments and rent surges. Plain and simple. One of the cons, this will not be easy. Easier path is probably done through the states, but it will not be something that is easy to do, but it needs to be done. And the last long-term solution that I would recommend is rent stability or rent control. We can do this through the state or the federal level. Right now, I believe there are a number of people that are calling for this through the federal level because the rents are it's just ridiculous. One of the pros, again, preventing rent surges. One of the cons is you may receive landlords the pushback from the landlords, right? Because once we do some type of rent control, that means that the landlords are going to make less money and they have people they have to pay too. So let's just keep that in mind. But these are the long-term solutions. And I've done a lot of research about this. I think that we've just been looking at this from a smaller lens. And I think we need to take a step back and look at this from a wider lens. Because in the end, the way that things have been going, this cost of living crisis, this is not sustainable. It is only a matter of time where more people are going to be evicted, more people are going to be homeless, and the cost of living crisis is a big part of that. Thank you.